Hello guys, welcome back to another video. So today we have got something special lined up for you, a Laravel 10 API crash course project. It's a small part of a larger point of sale system that we are building. So in this project, we will be building authentication module, customer module, product module for product management, and also order module for invoice generation. In this crash course, we will be focusing on building an authentication system with the help of JWT authentication token library. It's a very popular authentication method which is used by many other frameworks like Spring Boot, Laravel, and Node. We will be building essential API for our authentication module like login, getting the logged in user data, and also a logged out API. It's the foundation of our larger project. The authentication module is a crucial module for every web application. It ensures secure access control and protect the user data. You will learn how to implement JWT in our Laravel application and make your application safe and robust. Next, we will be diving into customer module. So we will be working with basic customer details like first name, last name, phone numbers, email, and zip code. You will learn here how to create, read, update, and delete customer records, a skill that is essential for building any web application. So if you want to follow the full tutorial project, don't forget to like and subscribe this channel, and also ring on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future tutorials. So without further talking, let's get started with Laravel 10 API crash course. Stay tuned and let's code. So this is the total project. So in the first part of this project, we will be creating authentication module. We will be using JWT token authentication for Laravel, and we will be generating this customer module where we will be creating REST API for the backend for listing of the customer, storing of the new customer, update the customer, and also delete the customer. So this table will have similar feature like a data table, like sorting, filtering, and also a global search. To work with Laravel application, you need to install PHP in your Windows system. To work with Laravel, you need to have latest PHP. So you can set up it in Windows via XAMPP. XAMPP has latest PHP 8.2. It comes with also a MySQL database, so you do not need to install it separately. We need also Composer for downloading PHP packages and also installing Laravel application. So for the version controlling, we will be using Git, and for the text editor, we will be using VS Code. So I have already installed XAMPP and install Composer in my local development environment. Now we will be opening VS Code, open folder. So our root directory, so our project directory will be POS-toot, select, and in here we will be installing Laravel. For this project we will be using latest Laravel 10. So before proceeding, let's check our PHP version. So it's PHP 8.2, Composer. So Composer is 2.5.5. Okay. To install Laravel, go to Laravel official website, click on documentation, and from the installation menu, scroll down, and we will be using Composer to create our Laravel application. Copy this command, paste it in here. We will name our application POS Laravel, and we will be using JWT rather than its default authentication system, that is Sanctum. So for this we will be using time on JWT auth library. So we will be installing this. So copy it, cd into this folder POS Laravel. So we are inside this folder. Let's install time on JWT auth. So while it's installing, let's create the database. So database name will be POS Laravel. Our database has been created. Go to .env file, and in here DB connection is MySQL and the database name will be POS Laravel. Password will be root, username will be root, and password will be blank. Before proceeding, we will have to modify our user table, and we will be adding some extra field in there. So go to database, migration, and in here we have some previously created default migration. Go to this go to create user table, and we will be adding some extra field: first name, last name, phone number, and zip code. And there will be a boolean field which will be is super admin. So there will be two types of user. One is super admin and another will be normal user. By default it will have false value. Next we need to add this field to our model. So go to app, models, user, and in fillable we need to add these fields. So first name, last name, zip code, phone number. So we have defined all the fields. Let's run the migration. PHP artisan migrate. Let's check the database. So we have our tables and schema. So this is the latest schema: first name, last name, phone number, zip code. Now we will be adding some fake user. For that, Laravel provides factory. So by default we have a user factory, and in here we need to generate fake data. So for first name we will be using first name. For last name we will be using last name. Then we will have phone number, which will be random number between 10 to 10. And for the zip code we will be creating 6 length of random numbers. So now go to Seeder. In here we can create fake user data. For this tutorial we will be creating two user. One is super admin, another is normal user. It will be super admin, so it will be true. Email will be super admin and another will be false, and email will be guest, GUEST, or normal user you can say. Okay, so let's seed the database. So as you can see here, we have two user, super admin and normal user, and super admin has super admin is true. Okay, password will be password. You can check it in the factory. So it is password. So before proceeding further, we need to initiate it as a Git repository. So git init, git add all, git commit am fresh. Okay, now we need to configure the JWT. So go to this readme. So in the providers we do not need to follow this step because we are using latest Laravel 10. We need to also publish the configuration, so we can modify the configuration of the JWT token. So in here we have the JWT configuration, and in here we can change the configuration like public key, private key, and most important is the expire time. By default it has 1 hour of expire time. We can also change it in here. So to override this, we can add this key to our environmental file. So .env in the bottom. So we will have it like 24/6. So the value is in minute. So 60 minute into 24, that's been 1 day. So it will be 1440. Okay, so 1440. Next we need to generate the JWT secret. Okay, so the secret has been generated and it is also added to your environmental file. Okay, next we need to configure our authentication system. so that Laravel can use JWT rather than its default authentication system, which is Sanctum. Okay, so we need to implement JWT subject in our user model. So go to app models user, and in here we have to implement JWT subject. Let's import it. So it is import in here. We will be removing this has API tokens because we are not using Sanctum, and we need to add these two methods to our user model. Okay, now everything is fine. So next we need to configure the auth card. So in the default we need to change it to API. So we will go to config, then auth, and in default guard is web because we are using solely for API generation and REST API generation. Because we are using Laravel for REST API generation, we will be using default guard is auth. So we will be using API as a default guard. Next, in the guard array we need to add this API. Okay, so it is the guard array and we need to add the API. Okay, so let's copy it and paste it in here. Okay, so API it is JWT. So next we will be adding some basic authentication routes. So let's copy it, go to routes api.php file. We will not be using Sanctum, so we can remove that. So we have login, logout, refresh and me, which will return authentication user data. I will change this to get. Okay, and it is prefixed with auth, so we can differentiate with other routes. By default, whenever we are actually putting any kind of routes inside api.php file, by default it is prefixed with API. You can check it in here, app providers, route service provider. So in boot method we are actually prefix it with API and it is guarded with middleware API. Okay, next we need to create this auth controller. Copy it, paste it in here. In app HTTP controllers auth controller we have our authentication controller. Now we need to implement all these methods which we are defined in the routes. So let's copy paste this method, copy all these 4 methods and paste it in here. So in the constructor we are guarding this auth controller with auth API middleware, that means the JWT middleware. We are accepting the login because login will not have any kind of authentication, it will be a public API. We are accepting the email and password and we are attempting auth with the credential, and if it is successful then it will return the token, otherwise it will return unauthorized 401. This respond with token function is nothing, just a response with JSON. So in here we are returning access token, token type and the expire time. So in here it is by default 60, but we have modified it, so we will be using env, then JWT TTL, and if it is not fine then it will be by default will be 60. Okay, let's double check that. So JWT TTL. Now run the application. Okay, so our application is running. So we will be testing these APIs with the help of Postman. So I have already configured some request with the auth folder for this tutorial. So we will be testing the logging route. So it will be our URL, then API, then auth and login. Request type will be post and this will be the JSON data. So let's try it. So target class auth controller does not exist. So let's check it. So in Laravel 10 we have some new syntax of defining routes. So So now we will be defining routes with this syntax, where we will be passing array as a second argument, and first argument will be the controller, then the second argument will be the method it is firing. Okay, so we need to also import that auth controller class. It is imported in here. Okay, so now let's try it. So it is working perfectly. Our access token has been generated. So let's copy it, and we will be checking the auth me, that is the authentication user data. Let's paste it in here, save it, send. Now we can get our logged in user data. So superadmin@example.com. So let's log out. It will be a post request, and we need to pass the authentication token. Paste it. Let's send it. So user is successfully logged out. Next, if we try to access the authentication user data, we will have this exception that route login is not defined. By default, whenever there is an unauthorized request, Laravel will redirect its user to the login route. So we need to stop this default behavior. So for that we need to go to app http middleware authenticate, and we need to comment this function. So it is actually redirecting to login. Okay, so we need to comment out this function, and we need to also modify the exception also. So by default, Laravel will be generating a default exception HTML page, but we need to return the exception as a JSON response. So for that, we will have to override the renderable function, which will be accepting a callback function. So it will be exception, and the request will be request illuminate support facade. Okay, so this is the request and this is the exception. So if the request has prefix API, we will be generating this array of exception manage. So we will be generating exception messages via get message method. To get the message, we will get the exception code, line of the exception, and the file where the exception has been occurred. Then we will be log this data for debugging purposes, and then we will be return the response as a JSON response. So error will be true, message will be the exception message, and we will pass the data, and the exception code will be 403. So let's check it. Okay, so we have a, so for this request we need to use illuminate HTTP request rather than the support request. Okay, so now let's check it, send. So as you can see here, we have returning the exception as a JSON response. So exception message is unauthenticated, code is 0, line is 95, and the file is middleware authenticate.php. Okay, so that's how we will be configuring our exception as a JSON response. So our authentication route has been completed. Next we will be building this customer module, and we will be creating the REST APIs for the customer module. First API will be the list API, where we will be grabbing all the list of customer from the database. Then we will have a store API to create the customer. Then we have a view API to view the customer, and we have a update API to update the customer, and a delete API to delete the customer. So let's build that. So let's create model and migration for our customer module. So PHP artisan make model customers, and we will be creating the migration also. So -m. So go to database migration, and this is the newly created file. We will be having some extra fields in here. So first will be string, let's say string, and first name, last name, phone number, email, then zip code, and all this field will be nullable by default. Now we need to define these columns inside our customer model. So go to app, customer model, and inside here we need to define our columns. So we have defined our columns: first name, last name, email, phone number, zip code. Okay, let's migrate the database. PHP artisan migrate. So it will be migrating the newly migration, not the old migration. Let's start the project. Let's create the controller for our customer module. PHP artisan, make controller, customer controller, which will be a resource controller. So let's go to app http controller, customer controller. So we have this previously built methods: index for querying all the list, create, we do not need any kind of create, store for storing the customer, we need that, show for viewing a single customer with ID, edit, we do not need edit page, and in the update we will have this ID of the customer and updated data, and for destroying we will have the customer ID and we will be deleting the data. Okay, so we need these 5 methods. So let's create one by one. First we need to wrap this whole method. First we will define try catch. So if there is any kind of exception happening in there, we will grab it and log the exception. Okay, so first we will be querying all the customers from the database. Let's import db. Then we will be returning this data, but rather than defining it in here, we will be using a function to send the response data, and we will be defining this function inside a controller. So we will be defining this function inside our base controller, so that all the methods inside our main controller will be available inside our child controllers. In here it will be customer controller. So first method will be send a response. So this function will be this function will accept the success message. By default it will be action successful, then the data and the response code, which will be by default 200, and it will be returning a response JSON. First parameter will be error is equal to false, message will be our custom message, and data will be our data that will be passed with the response, and this is our response code. We will be creating a similar function for sending error data. So inside that it will be accepting same parameters. By default it will be 400 and error will be true. Next we will be creating a function to handle the exception which will be occurring in the catch block. So for that we will be doing similar thing which we have done in the global exception handler. We will be grabbing the message, exception code, line, and the file. We will be logging the exception message for debugging purposes, and in here there will be a second parameter which will be send a response to true. By default its value will be true. If it is false, then we will not return any kind of JSON response, it will return null only. Let's import exception. Okay, now we can access this method from the child controller, that is the customer controller. So in here we will be returning this response, and message will be list fetch successfully, data will be our data, and code will be 200. So by default it's 200, it will be 200. And if there is any kind of exception, we will handle this exception. Handle exception, it will be having the exception itself, and the send response is true, so we will be sending the exception as a JSON response. PHP 8 also now support typecasting, so we can also define this functions type that will be JSON response, so that if we miss something in here, let's say forget to return the response, or if any place in our code we forget to return the response as a JSON response, it will be marked as red underline, so that we know that we have made some mistake. PHP 8 actually introduced this kind of new feature. So next we will have this store function. So we will be first defining the try catch block, then we will be validating the incoming request, then we will be using the validator method, then we will be using the Laravel validator to validate the message. So it will be illuminate support PCRUD validator. You need to actually import this specific validator class, otherwise it will not be working. So if the validator fails, we will be returning error message will be please enter valid input data. Then we will be returning this validator errors. Response code will be 400. And if everything goes right, then we will be creating the customer with the validated data. For any kind of database transaction where we will insert the data or delete the data, we need to use transaction, so that if any kind of exception occurred during the SQL insert, we can roll back to our previous state. So for that, Laravel provided with db begin transaction and commit command. So first we will begin the transaction. So after the query we will commit the transaction, otherwise the data will not be saved inside our database. And if anything exception occurred during this whole process, we will just roll back the transaction. Next we will be defining the show method. We will do the same thing with the try catch block. So first we will be defining this try catch block, then we will find the customer. If the customer is not found, we will be sending a error customer not found, and the error will be general then customer not found, and response code will be 404. And if everything is right, then we will be sending the response and the customer data. Response code will be 200. Next we will be updating the data. We will do the same thing. First we will define the try catch block, then we will be finding the customer. If the customer is present, then we will be validating the data. So in here we are using email and phone number will be unique for every customers, so that's why we are using unique table name and the column name. And during the update we are excluding the ID of the respective customer, so that during the update method we will not face any kind of unique error. So if the validator fails, we will return the error message, please enter the valid input data, and the validator errors. If everything goes right, then we will update the data, and if any kind of exception occurs, we will need to roll back the transaction. Then we will be returning the JSON response. Customer updated successfully, then the updated data, and response code will be 201. And we can also set the type, which will be JSON response. Next we will be defining the destroy method. As you can see here, because we are not returning any kind of JSON response, it is saying that it is void. Okay, so first we will be defining the try catch block. Then if anything occurs during the transaction, we will be roll backing the transaction, and In the try block, we will find the customer. If the customer is present, then we will be deleting the customer and return the response customer deleted successfully and the deleted data. And the response code will be 200. So we have defining all the 5 methods which we will be needed for our REST API in the front end. So let's go to API and we will be defining the routes. So for that we will be creating a route group. We will protect all the routes with the middleware of auth. Then inside here we will be defining all of our customer routes. So this is the routes which will be prefixed with v1 customer. So we can also do versioning. So we can test version 1 and version 2 of these APIs. The middleware will be auth, so we do not need to include it in here. And by default, the auth middleware will be using the API middleware because we have configured in the auth.config file. This is the list. For grabbing all the list, we will be hitting the index method. This is the post which will be hitting the, so for the list we will be using the index method. For post we will be using the store method. For viewing the data we will be using get, then we will pass the customer ID and we will be using the show method. For updating the data we will be using REST API put method and we will pass the respected customer ID. And for the delete we will be delete method and we will pass the customer ID. So let's test this and check this if it's working or not. So let's run the server, php artisan serve, go to postman. So I have already defined the request. So first we need to store the data. So let's try it. API version 1 customers and the data will be like this. Okay. So let's send it. So it is saying unauthenticated. So from the login we will log in again, copy this access token, and in this customer group we can set the authorization token globally. So go to authorization bearer and we need to paste it in here. So all the available requests inside this customer group have access to its bearer token. So go to authorization and inherit auth from parent. Okay, so let's send it. Target class customer controller does not exist. Okay, so for that we need to import it. Okay, otherwise it will not be working. So let's send this. Zip code field must be a string. Zip code field must not be greater than 5 characters. Okay, go to body. Okay, we have made some mistake. So in here it is saying 5, so we need to send it as a 6. Same for our, we will do the same for our update method also, string method. Okay, now let's try it. Okay, so we have a customer controller store, return value must be a JSON response. Okay, so maybe we just, so as you can see here we did not return the JSON response after creating the customer. So that's why we are getting this error. Return value must be a JSON response. Okay, so let's return it. So it will be send response customer created successfully data and the response code will be 201. Okay, so let's hit that again. Okay, so if we hit that again we can see here, email has already been taken. Let's check the list API. So in here we have one entry, John Doe. id is 1. So let's try the show method. It will be a GET request customer, then we have the customer id, send. So we have the customer data. In update, we will be updating the first name and last name so of the customer. So let's try it, send. We have successfully updated the first name and last name. And if we want to show this, yes, the data has been updated. So now we will delete the data. So go to delete. The method will be delete and the id will be 1. So let's send it. So customer deleted successfully. Let's check the list. As you can see here, the list returned empty. So our data is successfully deleted from the database. So that's how you will create REST API with latest Laravel 10. So for the REST API for our customer module has been ready.